he dared to make a request to him, for he sensed that here was the answer to both what he had come out here to seek and what he had to understand, to merely be able to dream of one day obtaining reconciliation with the one who had abandoned him. He asked of him, "Show me your world." And the other, who by the second gaze almost had fled in spite of all his will to stay and to power, here felt a small new hope of obtaining what he wanted from this desert and from this human being. He lifted his blackened arm, and instead of pointing into the deep, he pointed far and wide from the high cliff overlooking the earth, which, to the infinitely sharp eyes of the two, was brimful of people, cities, and many kinds of stone. "All this can be yours," he said. "When you had created it, you felt left out, and then you came to the flesh. But it has only led you here, into the desert. I am showing you the way out. Instead of creator, you can become ruler. Then they shall all be yours. I can teach you what to do, teach you the language of the stones and the deep." He spoke eagerly, and God felt a little sting in his heart by seeing in his eyes a reflection, a glint which reminded him how the other one had been back when he was still with him and they spoke together of living things. "You do not have to settle for one woman," said the one who had abandoned God. And then God exclaimed, "Settle?" and laughed into the deep and into the world. So the stones fell from the hands of the other, rolled down the slope, laughed out of the stream of his heart that flew so great and broad and singing that he could not hold it back. His entire happiness was clear to him in that moment. He was the beloved God, and he could not hide it to himself or the world in any way at all anymore. It broke out from him, it shone through him, and the other did not endure it. He turned from him and fled. As the grown man returned, with his free gaze and his golden face, he changed all who saw him. He was a richness that streamed through the city's streets, and he began to teach what he himself had learned from and with his mother. He healed the sick, for he understood one thing, that loneliness was the misery of the world, and that it was the enemy of all, and his only enemy. It touched him deeper than ever now that he himself had been freed from it, and now that he had seen how the one who had once abandoned the God-seeking communion, he himself had become lonelier still, and today was wandering around to the other lonely people, trying to draw them to him with the only thing a lonely person has, or the only thing he believes he has, this power, these stones that he placed in their chests instead of hearts. But God's beauty and joy awoke the hearts of many in them, so that they for the first time sensed that they had them and what they were, and how to pass the life in them on. And his mother loved her son and was so happy, because she had brought into the world the greatest beauty of all, and watched it grow in beauty by the day. But after he had returned from the desert, with the insight that he had gone there to find, God was living on with a little longing inside him. He knew that no one would understand it, but he could not help thinking about it. He dreamed about it, and therefore he told people around him a tale of a lost son who returned home. He described in detail the feast he would then prepare. But people did not like to sense a longing in him. He had himself awoken one in them, even in those closest to him, in everybody except for his mother, who was the only one capable of receiving him fully and therefore lacked for nothing. And it was a longing for more attention, more love, for being relieved fully from loneliness. Not one of the others could be fully relieved, though having great joy from being with him, because not one of them was able to accept God fully as he was, or themselves fully as they were. That is why they would sometimes fight about who was to sit closest to him, and each of them would try to obtain most of his attention. And that was why they did not like the story of the lost one, for this was where they got the strongest feeling that God's attention was elsewhere too, not only on them. Here they sensed that something was touching his heart, particularly deeply, and when he tried to hint whom the story was about, they got really angry, for the other they feared and did not like. This made God sad, for in this too there was a great loneliness. He placed the others into his story, in part to give them the attention they wanted, and in part to warn them against this. And then he stopped telling it anymore, but he was still dreaming. One day in his joy, his beauty grew so great that those whose hearts were stone could endure it no longer. For their master had not quite left the world, but had in burning rage ruminated for 3 years and concocted a new plan, a revenge for the infinitely compassionate gaze in the desert, and for the laughter of joy that he had heard and not been able to share. He is a human being, he had said to himself, and human beings can not only be won over by power, but also destroyed by power. If he is not willing to leave his humanity behind, then I shall take it from him, and take him from his mother, whom he loves, and who loves him. He also knew that human beings can be not merely removed from the world, but also tormented, and he inserted into those whose hearts of stones were gnawing them, and whose inner empty spaces were echoing hollowly at the words and smiles of God, and who hated his healing hands, thoughts about how they could get rid of him. It would probably have happened anyway. The sight of a happy God was too much for too many. It made all the things that could be changed become so visible. But no, it was simpler yet. His beauty was simply too great. So they took him and broke his body. When he had suffered much, the other returned to him. He stood in the corner of the prison and watched how these people beat God. When they had gone away to sleep and had told him, "Tomorrow you shall die," they sat alone together, the Son of Man and the unman, God and the one who had abandoned him. the other looked at God with everything that he could muster of gaze. He knew that this was a new loneliness that had begun for the one who had become human, and that from now on it would only grow until it killed. It was a loneliness he had not known himself, for only a creature of flesh can know it. The loneliness of being tormented. It is not equal to the lonely way you can be together, which is known by most people in this world. To live close by each other and yet remain strangers. This is a way of being together that annihilates one of the participants, and God suffered by it. He understood that the one who is annihilated is the one who believes he is annihilating the other, and he lowered his gaze. Then the other spread his wings so that they spanned from wall to wall. For he did not understand what God understood, that in that moment it was not only God who experienced a new kind of loneliness, the loneliness of the tormented, but that all loneliness in that moment reached its utmost limit and was fully concentrated into the most terrifying of all lonelinesses, the loneliness of the tormentor, which now became fully real, as in a moment of creation. There was one who was about to torment God to death, and who knew it. With the others it was different. They did not know what they were doing, but the other did. If he had seen God's gaze, he would in it have read the full meaning of his own deed, and he would have disintegrated. God would have destroyed him, whether he would or not, by his own reality, as what he was, just by being what he was in this exact situation. From now on, God concentrated only on one thing, keeping his gaze down, to protect the one who triumphed from annihilation. And he himself did not know whether he could. For if his gaze should fall upon the other, his will would not be able to prevent the annihilation, and his gaze passed through human eyes, and the human body is frail.